Over the past few weeks during Lent, we have been exploring the theme of fasting and feasting, recognizing that the traditional act of giving up something for Lent is less about self-depravity and more about creating space to focus on that which is important. In week 1, Pastor Pam shared about fasting on worry in our lives so that we can feast on hope and promise. Pastor Eric called on us to fast from the toil of work and feast on the creative play and joy that God offers us every day. Last week, Naomi preached a message of fasting from certainty and feasting on creativity and imagination. In each case, the fasting is not to experience suffering, but to become more deeply connected with God. God does not desire for us to suffer and does not find any kind of satisfaction in our misery of sacrifice. Giving up certain things during Lent is about trying to strip away that which distracts in an effort to hone in on our relationship with God and creation. And so this morning we will think broadly about what distracts us, the things that clutter our lives and take up unnecessary space and energy. Fasting on more, feasting on less. The phrase itself is somewhat paradoxical, but it is a call that resonates deeply with many of us as we struggle with streamlining and focusing our efforts and energies to handle increasingly busy and overwhelming lives. And while interest in minimalism and asking the question, does this spark joy in my life, with Marie Kondo, may have become a part of popular culture, the concept of simple living is something that is deeply ingrained and historically valued within our own faith tradition. The Church of the Brethren has a long history of embracing simple living. Our Anabaptist roots are shared with many others that to this day live plain lives in their communities. So much so that their lifestyles and dress make them particularly unique and easily identifiable. Our own denomination's heritage has a history of debates about acceptable dress, style, and adornments. And like so many debates that often divide us, the truth and substance of the conversation could get lost in superficial arguments about buttons, ties, facial hair, and other worldly things. The heart of the message about simple living could sometimes get lost in the details of dress and cultural identity. When tediously and obsessively dressing oneself in a specific way and monitoring the presentation of others, it is likely fair to say that such behaviors are no longer plain or simple. Folks trying to out-humble one another with how simply they can be and present themselves is no longer either humble or simple. Now, this is not to say that the motivation behind such things is not well-intentioned or rooted in healthy understandings about simple living, but even these efforts can become distracting when the origin of their purpose is sidelined. One of the purposes for simple living is to identify and cast aside that which is so worldly and unnecessary that it provides limitations and distractions to our relationship to God and one another. A 1996 statement by the Church of the Brethren entitled "Simple Living" opens with this paragraph. Jesus Christ gathers us as a community blessed with faith, with love for God and each other, and with hope in the coming reign of Christ which reorders our lives now. Simplicity is the way of Jesus, God's gift to us. The New Testament and the Holy Spirit's guidance have led the brethren to practice this plain way. We affirm our heritage that began with people like Anna and Alexander Mack, who gave their lives and wealth for God's service until they died in material poverty and spiritual riches. Simplicity is living not conformed to the world, but transformed by Christ. Neither rules nor programs, neither simplistic answers nor legalism can fully define the simple life. Jesus' way of simplicity is at the heart of the gospel. It is central to our faith and practice, not optional. To make it less than central is sinful. Simple living is sometimes difficult, but to those who embark on this humble journey, God provides joy and peace. As I mentioned before, these practices of decluttering and minimalism have become the topics of TV shows and popular culture trends. There's a lot of evidence that suggests that these practices of simplifying our lives offers great benefits to our physical, mental, and emotional health. Many people are discovering the freedom that comes with liberating oneself from the weight of unnecessary trappings and belongings. Too often, we have fallen victim to measuring our wealth and success by our status and stuff. And boy, do we love stuff. An article in Scientific American this past year concluded that human-made stuff now outweighs all life on Earth. Think about that for a second. Buildings, boats, computers, paper. The infrastructure of daily life now weigh in at approximately 1.1 trillion metric tons, equal to the combined dry weight of all plants, animals, fungi, bacteria, archaea, and protists on the planet. The creation of this human-made mass has rapidly accelerated over the past 120 years. Artificial objects have gone from just 3% of the world's biomass in 1900 to on par with it today. And the amount of new stuff being produced every week is equivalent to the average body weight of all 7.7 billion people. Decisions that we make as consumers to rid our lives of an overabundance of stuff not only helps to promote clarity in our own lives, a deeper devotion to what is really important, but also reduces our social and environmental impact. Seeking to minimize the negative effect that we have on our world around us is an important factor in keeping in harmony with God's creation. Our choices affect others. I'm reminded of a popular saying I heard growing up within the Church of the Brethren: living simply so that others may simply live. And that is a choice that all of us can choose to make. But what does it even mean to live simply? Well, to start, I think it's important to recognize that this question probably has a variety of answers for many different people. Simple living in one region of the world may look completely different than another, and there are certain practices and values that might be weighed and ranked differently, depending on personal preference. While there may be objective ways of looking at how certain products or practices have specific impacts on society and the environment, the ways in which we value those things in our own lives may differ. For some, it is relatively easy to eat local, organic, or lower down on the food chain. For others, acquiring such food is not simple at all. For some, public transportation or riding a bicycle is a simple living choice. For others, a long commute or extra time away from helping at home can make those choices challenging. For some, a season of life that includes caring for someone who is sick or for young children may require different purchasing habits. Still, there are almost certainly aspects of our lives that we can identify and simplify to strengthen our relationship with God and our neighbors. At its core, simple living involves an assessment of wants and needs, and trying to live life in a way that does not embrace unnecessary excess. This is not to say that one must seek to intentionally live uncomfortably or in misery, but to be prudent in choices about what we really do need. There is a challenge here, too, in accepting the steady march of human progress with science and technology. While conveniences like climate-controlled homes, electricity, and refrigerators may have been considered luxuries in the past, they're no longer commonly understood as being such. Can one own a smartphone and claim to be living simply? Some people would answer that question differently. Full disclosure, I own a smartphone and many other things, admittedly too much other stuff to claim to be any kind of real role model for exactly how best to live simply. I'm reminded of that on a weekly basis as I drag 2 full trash cans down to the curb. Our children have been both great teachers and excuses to fall short of living more simply. Babies and young children seem to require so much stuff. Parents out there know what I'm talking about. Packing up to go on a short trip to the grandparents seems to require so much gear. Multiple trips to the car, strollers, toys, diaper bags, bottles, snacks. Ashley and I are constantly asking ourselves, do we really need this? And we have gotten better at saying no. Well-meaning grandparents and friends have contributed to the already unnecessary amount of toys, books, and just stuff that we have already purchased for our children. And still, favorite toys end up being paper towel rolls and kitchen utensils. Slowly, we have been removing objects from our living room, or now more appropriately called the playroom. Things have started to disappear from that room, and to our great joy and surprise, no one seems to be noticing. It is fascinating how quickly we can acquire stuff, so much of it unnecessary. But equally comforting is discovering how quickly we can forget about it. When Ashley and I moved to Elizabethtown, we did not have a lot of stuff. We were moving from Camp Sotara, where we lived in a pretty small house called the Chalet. It was just a kitchen/living room, a loft, a bedroom, and a bathroom. I used to describe how small the place was by telling people that if we plugged the vacuum cleaner into a specific outlet, we could actually vacuum the entire place, every single corner of the house, without having to change outlets. And now, almost 5 years and 2 kids later, our house is filling up with stuff. Like many of you, much of it important, but much of it definitely not. And so we have tried to get rid of things that we do not need. The process is not easy, but it's been rewarding. And we have discovered that even more important than getting rid of things that you no longer need is not acquiring those unnecessary new things in the first place. And this, of course, takes discipline. But here is the thing about simple living. Like so many other things in our lives, it really is about our attitude and intentionality. When we try to center ourselves on what it means to follow Jesus and how we live out that choice as a consumer, simple living becomes a little easier. You see, too often we approach simple living like how we might approach quitting a beloved habit or a new diet. We think this is going to be miserable, but I'm going to push through and do it because I know it's the right thing to do. That type of attitude rarely works for creating sustained change. Usually change does not happen until where you are becomes more uncomfortable than where you want to be. And so thinking about living more simply will be some kind of miserable sacrifice that frames the decision-making process. Instead, it's better to see such choices as the gift that they really are, an opportunity to more closely follow in the way of Jesus by caring for creation and our neighbors. Too often we are setting unnecessary standards for ourselves and one another about what we really need. And what do we really need? To be clear, I'm not advocating that we all sell our homes and belongings and move to a life of foraging in nature. For one, that's likely not even environmentally sustainable for all of us. Still, I'm certain that we can all evaluate some of our behaviors and consumer habits and discover ways that we can live more simply. So while the goal here should not be misery and martyrdom, it's also important to recognize that to live more simply does require intentionality, work, and effort. But it is worth reminding ourselves that the status quo of living under the weight of unnecessary stuff or the pressure of requiring an extra storage unit or contributing to the environmental destruction and social harm through our consumerism is not an easy or harmless position either. For each of us, this journey is different. For some, giving up a specific daily coffee routine is completely off the table. For others, it may be possible. For some, eating an entirely vegetarian diet is doable and indeed even enjoyable. For others, it may not be. In general, though, greater awareness of our actions is essential. As followers of Jesus, we cannot bury our heads in the sand. Making informed choices about how our lifestyle and consumption habits negatively impact others and the environment should be a core part of who we are. We might make those calculations differently, but refusing to make them and pretending our actions and choices do not create ripples around us is harmful and indeed unchristlike. We ought to be putting flesh on our beliefs, putting love into action. We are called to love God and to love one another. We do that when we seek to live humbly in ways that do not harm one another. It is not about drawing attention to oneself. It is not about having a goal to make ourselves suffer. It is about how all of our choices can show love. And love sometimes requires sacrifice. And you know what? What happens when you make a sacrifice for someone else out of love? What happens when you know that tough choices or inconveniences for yourself lead to positive things for someone else? We're just fine. Indeed, we're joyful. It's why people choose to live simply. It's why those people don't lament it. It's why when you pass over an unnecessary purchase at the supermarket, you don't regret it every day, all week long. It may be a natural and part of being human to want more, even at the expense of others. But part of being a follower of Jesus requires rejecting that way of thinking and finding authentic pleasure in doing so. We know that true joy comes in the love we can share with one another and not in the abundance of possessions. Jesus makes this explicitly clear in the parable of the rich fool. Watch out. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist in an abundance of possessions. And he told them this parable. The ground of a certain rich man yielded an abundant harvest. Then he thought to himself, what should I do? I have no place to store my crops. Then he said, this is what I'll do. I'll tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I will store my surplus grain. And I'll say to myself, you have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry. But God said to him, you fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then you will get what you have prepared yourself. This is how it will be with whoever stores up things for themselves, but it is not rich towards God. Not only does this parable speak to our tendency to hoard and protect our wealth and belongings as if they will be the pathway to joy, but reveals an arrogance about how we think about possessions. In the created world around us, energy flows from place to place, temporarily stored in food or in the bodies of those who consume it, then return to the earth and regenerated again in a new form. There is a cycle, a flow to the natural world, a trust and dependence on the rest of creation for sustainability. Humans, we don't do so well with that. We tend to clog up the system, exploiting natural resources, hoarding things from creation, and all the while patting ourselves on the back for how great and resourceful we are at doing it. Even in this parable, we read, the ground of a certain rich man yielded an abundant harvest. The ground yielded the harvest, not the man. Sure, there was certainly some work from the farmer, but the rest of the parable is about the selfish ownership saying, my crops and my surplus grain. There is an arrogance about ownership of what this world produces, even when we contribute to its fruition. But this parable also ends with a chilling reminder that ownership of possession is fleeting. Our need and desire to possess so much stuff does not originate from a trusting mindset of abundance, but a fearful mindset of scarcity. The wealth and possessions that we have are fleeting and temporary. They change hands and move around even during our own lifetimes. To cling to such things and hoard them reflects not only a distrust in our Creator, but also in our neighbor's ability to utilize and benefit from them as well. And so we see in the very next verses in Luke that we are to consider the ravens. They do not sow or reap. They have no storeroom or barn. Yet God feeds them. And how much more valuable are you than birds? Who of you, by worrying, can add a single hour to your life? Since you cannot do this very little thing, why do you worry about the rest? Well, there are plenty of people in the world now and in our own community who do worry. And their reasons are justified because they are living in poverty or without access to clean water or health care, or are subject to violence or climate change. Their situation is critical, and it is not because the world does not have enough food or wealth or water to help them. It's because it is stored up in barns and bank accounts. Living simply means opening our barns and bank accounts, ridding ourselves of excess and abundance, avoiding those frivolous acquisitions in the first place, and rejoicing in the joy that comes from doing so. It liberates us to see God more clearly. It frees us to focus and support the things that do truly matter. To live simply is to simply live and unburden ourselves from what is unnecessary in the world, to refuse to play by the rules that we foolishly impose on one another and ourselves, and instead embrace the abundance that God offers to us with love that we, too, can freely extend. The world will always tell you that you need to have more, that you need to be more, that you need to do more. God reminds us that while we are not perfect, you are already enough. And that when we unshackle ourselves from the unnecessary baggage and excess stuff in our lives that distracts us from the love of God, we will find that what is left may be less, but is really more.